welcome to the 2008 Brown Club of Oregon Ballot Measure Debates. I want to start off by thanking the Brown Club of Oregon for putting in the hard work to bring this event together. I also want to thank Morgan Holmes from the Oregon Public Broadcasting for hosting the event, Dennis Gleason from Dark Wing Productions, and Dave Slay from Tualatin Valley Community TV for filming and broadcasting the event. I'm going to speak very briefly because we have a very ambitious program today. But Oregon, established the initiative process in 1902. It was the third state to establish the initiative process, and it was overwhelmingly successful. The election was won 92% to 8%. It was so popular in Oregon that in the early years it was actually called the Oregon system. And it went across the state. Half of the states in the Union took up the Oregon system. And since 1902, between city, county, and state initiatives, referendums, and referrals, we've had 809 since 1902. 372 have passed, many of which have really impacted our lives. In 1902, the citizens of Oregon took a social contract that we will be informed on the issues of the day so that we can vote wisely on our ballots. And that's why I thank all of you for coming today to watch the Brown Club Ballot Measure Debates. The format will be simple. It'll be 4-minute opening remarks in favor, then 4-minute opening remarks in opposition. Then there'll be 9 minutes of questions from the audience, and then 1 minute of conclusion from each side. There are 12 measures on the ballot this year, and of those, 2 have no opposition. And 2 of them are actually the same issue, taking different angles from it. And in a very unusual situation, if both get to 50%, then the one that has the most will be the one that becomes law. So we'll be debating those together. So we will have 9 20-minute debates today. So I wanted to start off with the first 2 measures that we won't be debating. They are measures 54 and 55. 54 amends the Constitution to standardize voting eligibility for school board elections with other state and local elections. The reason why this issue came up is that it's actually people who are 18 to 21 years old are not allowed to vote in school board elections. It's just a mistake, and so they are correcting this mistake, and so there's no organized opposition. Measure 55 amends the Constitution, and the ballot title is Changes the Operative Date of Redistricting Plans, allows affected legislators to finish term in original district. This is so that when we do redistricting, if a current legislator is no longer in his district, he doesn't have to, or she doesn't have to move to the district in order to keep their seat. They can fill out their term. Again, there's no opposition to this one. So with no further ado, I will start off our first debate. Measure 56. It amends the Constitution, provides that May and November property tax elections are decided by majority of voters voting. In favor, we have Scott Bailey. He is the co-founder of Community and Parents for Public Schools. And in opposition, we have Don McIntyre, the president of Taxpayers Association of Oregon. And first up is Scott.
Thanks, Dave. I'd like to first start by explaining what Measure 56 is, and to do that I have to explain what the double majority law is. So before 1996, when a local property tax measure was on the ballot, it was a simple majority vote. If a majority voted yes, it was approved. If the majority voted no, it was not approved. End of story. Since 1996, we've had a law called the double majority, which means for a local property tax measure to be adopted, it has to have 2 majorities. First, 50% of registered voters must have voted in that election. And second, a majority of the voters must have voted yes. So 2 majorities have to happen. So what Measure 56 does, there are two exceptions to that, and those are the November general elections in even number years, like this November one coming up in 2008. The next one would be November of 2010, and so on. What Measure 56 does is expands the number of exceptions to be 2 elections every year, May and November. So let me explain with a little bit of history why I think this is a good idea. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, Portland Community College had a tax levy on the ballot. It passed overwhelmingly in terms of the yes votes with a 30,000 vote majority. But it failed by 2,000 votes to reach the 50% threshold. So it did not pass. What we have in this case, what we've had in some cases, is that people who are opposed to tax measures will tell their supporters to not vote instead of voting. So it gives power to people who don't vote. Now, we have a pretty good democratic tradition in this country where if you don't vote, your vote doesn't count. So the current double majority law actually violates that principle and gives power to people who don't vote. So for example, in that PCC where you had 2,000, if 2,000 more people had voted no, the law would have been approved. That's essentially giving them 15 votes for every 1 vote because their 2,000 counteracted 30,000 voters who voted yes. A second example, similar, Gladstone School District had a levy on the ballot. Again, I think a 62% yes vote. It fell 500 votes short. If 500 more people had voted no, then the measure would have passed. So it gives people an incentive to vote, to not vote, and I think that's something we want to avoid. In our society, we want to encourage people to vote. That's what democracy is all about. That's why we're all here tonight, participating in our democracy. The second feature, though, is that Gladstone measure was later approved a year and a half later at a general election. But in the meantime, the construction costs for the schools, the bill had risen from $30 million to $40 million because of the high inflation rate for construction materials. So not only do I think this is bad government, but this is more costly government and a bad way to do business. And my time is about up, so I'll hand it over to Don.
Thank you very much. The feature about this measure that I would like to remind everyone of is that it's a referral of the legislature. And what it seeks to do, in spite of its very innocuous ballot title that says that in May and November elections of each year that the majority rules, and that sounds pretty innocuous. But let me remind everyone what the purpose of the double majority was. And it is to make it relatively difficult to raise property taxes. Because this is what was left out of my opponent's description. The need of the government to put this in place is its sense that it needs to raise property taxes. That is the only possible reason for removing a pretty good restriction. And the restriction simply says that, look, if the government wants to increase property taxes, then let's do it every 2 years at a big general election when a lot of people turn out. Remember that Oregon had a history of escalating property taxes, and that is what led to Measure 5, later Measure 47, and then later Measure 50, is that the government class constantly put the pressure on to raise property taxes in every election they could muster. Now, you can understand that in special elections, when you don't have a big turnout, then you've got a very energetic, activist class of people who benefit from tax increases and they're not really thinking of the welfare of property owners. The property tax, as many of you believe, and I certainly do, it's the most onerous of all the ways that the government takes money from its citizens, simply because there is no good relationship between a person's circumstances and the amount of property taxes they have to pay. Income taxes are tough, sales taxes are rough in the states that have them, but at least those taxes relate to your circumstances. When you're making a lot of money, you pay more taxes. But in property, you can be disabled, and inevitably, your property taxes keep going up, disabled or out of work or whatever. So that's why we need to maintain as much stricture on the property tax as we can. Even with our limitations, most property owners will tell you that their taxes are good and plenty. Now, the thing about the issue of a double majority, he characterized it as kind of undemocratic. Well, if that's undemocratic, then so must be the law that says our legislature must have a supermajority to raise taxes, not property taxes, but taxes generally. So it's a principle of the quorum. Generally, a quorum in most interpretations is simply this. You have a majority of those eligible to vote and make a law, you've got to have at least a majority turnout. If you think about it, the double majority law sounds like it's twice as tough, but it isn't. It could be called the 25% law, because if you have a 50% turnout of the electorate, just 50% of those registered, and that's not a big turnout, then if you get a majority of those, that makes it 50% of 50% is 25%. 25% plus 1 raises property taxes. That's a pretty easy standard. And if the government has a good argument for its tax increases, then it better make them and get a good turnout.
Why don't I start out by asking each person, and we've now had the double majority for over a dozen years, how in real terms has it affected our communities, positively and negatively?
Well, I don't know. That's a tough question to answer. It depends on your view of increasing taxes. The double majority has allowed property taxes to increase. I, for one, and many property taxpayers think that's enough. They don't want to have to fend off a vote 4 times where they don't have to have a big turnout. Again, the people that want taxes are motivated, and they get the turnout. If you think about it, think of how many people work for the government and benefit from tax increases. They pay property taxes, but when their pay and benefits go up based on property taxes, they're a lot better off than the person that has property but doesn't work for the government.
Well, let's see. If you look at the record, there have been about 140 elections where the double majority has prevented a majority pass measure from passing. So it has had an effect on the level of government services. Don wants to characterize everything that government does as this kind of a government class, this activist class out there. He apparently doesn't want to give the majority of the people the ability to decide their own decisions. He thinks it's just the government class. When he talks about a quorum, every election we have, a quorum is there. Everybody gets an envelope in the mail and has a chance to vote. And by the way, one of the good reasons for taking another look at this measure is that the double majority was passed before we had the mail vote. Now, every time there's a vote, we do have a quorum because everybody has a chance to vote. At the legislature, if you're talking about a quorum, it's completely different because you're talking about are a majority of people there in the building ready to vote on the floor. And I submit at every election, everybody's there with a chance to vote.
If I may follow up, think about that. Then if everyone has a ballot and they choose not to vote, then that is an act of voting. That's quorum busting, and that's a legitimate. In other words, if you say, "I'm not going to vote," I know it's going to count against the measure. Then what the person not voting is saying, they're either indifferent, indolent, or they may be just saying, I want the status quo.
Yes, could you come to the microphone, please?
I just moved to Oregon recently, and so I have a couple of questions that come from my lack of knowledge. Mr. McIntyre, you mentioned disabled homeowners as an example of people who would be especially hard hit, and I was wondering, are there no exemptions for disabled people that can be applied for?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And then I had another question about the sales tax. How does the sales tax relate to people's circumstances? Can you explain a little bit more about that? You said that sales tax and income tax related directly to people's circumstances. So I understood exactly what you meant about income, but I was a little bit unclear about sales tax.
You've been here long enough to know that we don't have a sales tax?
I've been here quite long enough to know that.
Okay. Well, the reason I brought up the sales tax and the income tax as methods of taxation that relate to people's status, when you have more money, you spend more money, and therefore you'd be paying more taxes. That was what I was implying.
Oh, but a sales tax, I think many economists would agree, is a regressive tax. So, you know, people who, depends on what you're taxing for sales, but
but we're not here to talk about the sales tax.
But you mentioned it, so I just wanted to see
all right.
what
We're trying to debate the merits of the property tax and whether a property tax is a good tax or a bad tax. That's not what this measure is about.
Yes, it is. It is
Excuse
about
me,
property taxes.
Excuse me, sir. It's a measure about whether this method of voting is fair.
And what form of taxation does it relate to?
It relates to property taxes.
All right.
But it's not a vote on whether a property tax is a good tax or a bad tax, because there are times when we can't decide that in terms of the majority of voters because of the double majority.
You can decide it every other November when there's a large turnout. If you want to raise property taxes, then do your planning, make your case, run your campaign, and win it in an important election.
Mine is not directly limited to this particular ballot measure. It's just in the larger sense, if we have things to pay for, schools and infrastructure, and we don't pay for it via property taxes, then, Mr. McIntyre, would you suggest we raise income taxes or institute a sales tax? How would we pay for these?
Well, we pay for them the way we are paying them now. Remember, and you mentioned schools, the schools are a direct obligation of state government. That's what the Constitution says. It says the Legislative Assembly shall provide for a general system of common schools. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that education must or shall be paid for by property. What led to the property tax revolt in Oregon was the school tax. Prior to the passage of ballot measure 5, it was 2/3 of the property tax, and it was crushing people. Remember, this has to do with limitations. The government needs to be restrained, and the laws are sufficient to provide property taxes to the government, and even a mechanism to allow government to take money above those constitutional limits if they're voter approved. We just want a good, solid turnout when those elections happen, and that is always every other November.
But we are, of course, the government. The government is us. And so if the funds are not sufficient to pay for the needs of the public schools, would you suggest that we raise income taxes or institute a sales tax?
No, what I'd suggest is we have a vote on it, and we are having a vote on it. Remember, the double majority was put in place by Oregon voters, ma'am.
And also remember that in terms of, Don says he wants a good turnout, the double majority law discourages turnout if you're a no voter. And I want to make another point clear, looking back at the property tax. I am an economist, and if you look at the history of the property tax total revenues over time before they were limited, they were not going up by leaps and bounds as what Don said, if you adjust for population and for income. What was happening is that property tax was being shifted off of businesses and onto homeowners. So if you looked at the homeowner share, it looked like it was growing out of control. But the total revenue for government was not. And that's what led us to a property tax limitation.
Here's the rub. Here is an economist who is arguing in favor and on the side of the government. The government is paramount
I'm not
to
arguing on the side
the
of
property
the
tax.
government. I'm arguing
Prior to
on
the
the
passage
side
of Measure
one
5
person,
in
one
Oregon,
vote.
prior to the
Just let Don
passage
talk.
of Measure 5, you could be living in a $60,000 ranchy, $60,000 house, and pay $3,000 a year for the privilege of living in your own home. That was a tax imposed by the government, and that's what the limitations that we have were designed to correct, and they did it for the most part, but property taxes in Oregon are still, as you know, if you pay them, they're tough.
Scott, you want to respond?
Where to begin? If you look at the total tax revenues in Oregon, we're below the national average. If you look at school funding per pupil, we're at about 90% of the national average. We used to be right at the national average. We can look at a whole variety of views. But that's not what this election is about. It is about whether this is a fair form of voting. Because if we have a fair form of voting, which Measure 56 will bring us more of, then the people can decide what their tax load is, whether they want to pay more in taxes to get more in services or not. That's up to them. That's up to us. Don, again, he talks about government-imposed taxes. Those taxes were imposed by a vote of the people.
Okay, we need to finish this is the end of the question-answer period. We're now doing 1-minute conclusions from each side. Scott?
Actually, I think I just did a pretty good
Is
job
that-
of summarizing
we count that?
what I'm talking about. So Measure 56 is about making voting on property tax measures more fair, and giving us twice a year the opportunity to vote on measures on a simple majority, if there are any property tax measures to be voted on then. It would eliminate for those elections the ability of a small group of voters to sit out the election and so to sink the measure and to so that they would not have a disproportionate impact on the election, instead of encouraging them to vote their conscience and vote no. Thank you.
As I said before, and I will say for the first time tonight, an old aphorism that the past is prologue. And we have seen people who benefit directly from taxes, and I'll say, for example, Oregon's public employee unions, the most powerful political force in the state, they have the ability to get out the vote. They have the ability to make the difference. And if we have, say, a 20% turnout of registered voters, 20%, and they get a majority of those, that's a 10% group of people imposing property taxes on people who just want to go to work, earn their daily bread, and pay a reasonable amount to the government. We pay good and plenty property taxes, as I said, and if the forms of government in this state need some more support, then we do have general revenues. And we go to the general fund, and we go to all those other funds that are in Salem where everyone participates in the debate, and the burden is not spread onto someone just for owning a house.
Thank you very much, Scott Bailey and Don McIntyre, for coming and informing us on ballot measure. Next, we have ballot measure 60. The ballot title is Teacher, Classroom Performance, Not Seniority, Determines Pay Raises, Most Qualified, Teachers Retained, regardless of seniority. And in favor, we have Jeff Crump, former legislator, talk radio show host, and school board member. And in opposition, we have Dana Hepper, statewide advocacy coordinator for Stand for Children. Jeff?
Thanks, first of all, to you and the Brown Club of Oregon for offering the opportunity to come forward and share my thoughts on this issue. Americans for Prosperity is a free enterprise limited government organization. We operate in 25 states with 280,000 members in Oregon. I'm the state director, and we have about 8,000 members here. So generally, we are involved in economic issues only, but we do have a government reform agenda that includes school reform, and that's why we're in favor of this particular message. I will also say that I am chairman of the board of the of Oregon Connections Academy, which is a virtual online public charter school. This is our 4th year of operation. We have 2,500 children that are enrolled in our school district, and we utilize merit pay. We call it performance pay is our terminology. I will say this, and I have to give this disclaimer: we are a public charter school. We are not endorsing this measure, and I am not endorsing this measure as the board chairman. I am doing this as Americans for Prosperity and a talk show host. I want to make that very clear. We believe that one of the reasons that I think it's so important that we offer an opportunity to implement this type of concept is, first of all, I've seen it work. And I think there is a way that it can work, and that's part of the genius of how this is written in terms of its simplicity, because it allows a tremendous amount of flexibility. The principle behind this is something we also agree very strongly on as an organization, is that people should be rewarded when they do excellent work, rather than the current system, which we believe can reward people when they do well, or simply allows mediocrity to continue. And personally, I feel very strongly that children, we should be giving the best opportunity for children to be educated in this state. In fact, I think back to my time that I was in school, and some of the teachers that made the most profound impact on my life personally, that I still remember even to this day, were teachers that were very unique in how they taught me. And I appreciate that very much. I believe that this measure can create that opportunity. In fact, I think it creates opportunities where there don't exist today. I think offering incentives financially can be an opportunity for inner city schools, where there can be an opportunity there for them to attract perhaps a teacher who's willing to go into a very tough, a very difficult environment and be creative and be innovative. I think it offers those opportunities and the flexibility for administrators to put together a plan in terms of how you would administrate this type of a circumstance, and one that can be successful. What do I mean by that? Very simply this. The key to this type of a concept, principled position, is that teachers have to be involved in setting the goals and the measurements by which they're going to be judged. It doesn't have to be, and by the way, that's how we do it at Oregon Connections Academy. It doesn't have to be solely limited to just classroom testing. It can be other methodologies of how do you, if you sit down with a teacher, say a music teacher, and I spent a lifetime in music, how do you help a music teacher define classroom performance? That's where the teacher is so important to have teacher buy-in. They have to be involved in the process of setting those goals and defining what those are. The vagueness of this measure is its strength in that it allows the flexibility for teachers and administrators to work together, and yes, unions to be a part of that discussion. It can also be its weakness if it's not implemented properly. But I have a lot of faith in the same administrators that are teaching our children today, that we're entrusting with our entire system. I have the faith to believe that they can literally figure out a way of doing this, because we have, that works pretty well for us, that can be fair to teachers, and more importantly, can achieve results.
Thank you. Dana?
My name is Dana Hepper. I'm the statewide advocacy coordinator with Stand for Children. And Mr. Kropf and I had the opportunity to talk about this exact same topic a few weeks back on OPB's morning call-in show, Think Out Loud. And we learned during that show, I think, that we agree on a lot of fundamentals. We, of course, agree that every child in Oregon deserves the greatest opportunity to learn and be successful in life. And we actually also agree that there is a way to incorporate pay for performance in a way that really works. And we've seen that happen in a couple other states and districts around the country. And where we disagree is, I don't believe that Measure 60 gives every child an opportunity in Oregon to succeed. In fact, I think it gets in the way of that. And I don't agree that Measure 60 implements pay for performance in a way that can work. And I'm not alone. I feel this way strongly as a former teacher at a low-income Title I sanctioned school under No Child Left Behind. I feel this way strongly as a member of Stand for Children, and fortunately I'm joined by a coalition that includes over 70 groups and individuals, including organizations you probably trust, like the Oregon PTA, teachers, principals, and school boards across the state. And there are a few main reasons that I'd like to highlight why all of these organizations have come together to oppose this version of implementing pay for performance in Oregon. First, we're all deeply concerned that Measure 60 takes away local control from our school districts and communities to decide the best way to reward their teachers. In fact, it mandates that those school districts not consider classroom experience when they're figuring out how to pay their teachers. And one thing I learned about the charter school that Mr. Kropf is associated with when we talked a few weeks ago is that actually classroom experience is one of the factors that's considered under their functional pay for performance system, where it's excluded explicitly by Measure 60. The second reason these organizations and me personally oppose Measure 60 is that it's the most extreme example of this that we've seen in the country, and it's full of unintended consequences. As a former teacher, I'm most concerned about the unintended consequences of increased testing that this measure will have on our schools. And we're not pulling this out of thin air. Districts that have implemented pay for performance systems, similar although not as extreme as this, have seen testing of students increase. And to me, as a teacher, that means less time spent doing critical thinking opportunities, more time spent in testing, less time spent in learning. Finally, Measure 60 is unfair to students and teachers. I mentioned earlier that I taught at a Title I school, very low income, very high turnover. And the concern there is that often the students in my school weren't doing as well on standardized tests, a common measure for classroom performance, as students in more affluent schools. And in fact, when the state of Florida implemented a pilot program, now this is doing it statewide, but when they implemented a pilot program, they found that only teachers in affluent schools received pay for performance bonuses. That's a fundamental problem with this system. So I urge all of you in the audience and anyone listening or watching to join a broad coalition in voting no on Measure 60.
Thank you. It's now for the question and answer period.
It's a question for both of you. How do you account for the more difficult subjects, the science courses, the math courses, the things that we do not exceed at in this country, and how would this measure attract or continue to try to attract teachers to teach the difficult subjects where the scores are perhaps a little more difficult to attain?
Fair question, and certainly one that goes along, I think, with what I mentioned with music. I think is a good example of that. I have to go back to the issue of how it's implemented. The teacher has to have that input with the administration to say, all right, how are we going to fairly measure what is maybe not just test results, but progress in a class, in a difficult subject. If it's unfairly implemented as a concept, then first of all, it won't work, and teachers are not going to be in favor, and they're not going to feel like they're being rewarded for really going that extra mile like so many teachers do today. We know that. And if they are rewarded, then I think clearly the word gets out there amongst teachers, and they certainly talk just like all of us do, that this way of doing this works, and you can be fairly judged on your performance professionally. And again, I go back, it's not just all about testing here. We don't have to just focus on testing as a measurement of your performance. Now, we do include that as part of the measurement, but that testing and those measurements of success or progress, all of those are agreed upon with the teacher, and that is that critical factor there. If the concept fails anywhere, in a school district, and then with difficult subjects, or frankly with any other difficult subject, or any subject rather, it probably doesn't work very well. With us, by the way, and I want to clarify something that Dana said, when we do take classroom experience into consideration when we're establishing the pay rate of a teacher when they're hired on at our school. Beyond that, it is based on overall school performance. All teachers can get a bonus if the school meets certain goals throughout the year, and then certainly individual classroom performance. And again, the measure is written such that it doesn't define what classroom performance is. So again, I think the flexibility to achieve what your question, I think, so importantly points out is there in the measure, if it's implemented correctly.
Dana?
I think you have a great question about how this can affect teacher recruitment, and especially in areas like science and math. And those are particularly relevant right now as the Oregon State Board of Education has increased graduation requirements in science and math, and those are affecting today's freshmen. And I think the reality is we don't know how this measure is going to impact recruitment of science and math teachers, and you raise an incredibly valid question. And there is certainly the potential for teachers to be scared off from teaching subjects that are more difficult to achieve high test scores, meaning potentially more difficult to receive your pay for performance measure, pay for your performance reward. And when other states have looked at pay for performance systems and began to implement them, they've started with pilot programs instead of what Measure 60 does, which is mandate all 200 school districts in the entire state of Oregon develop a system right now. If Oregon would like to look at the impact of pay for performance systems on teacher recruitment, I would be incredibly interested in Oregon starting a pilot program to measure those impacts, come back with a report, and then see if we wanted to expand that pilot program. And in fact, there are some innovative school districts in Oregon doing that right now. The Sherwood School District and the Tillamook School District both are investigating how they pay teachers, its impact on teacher recruitment and retention. And I think as a state we should look at those and see if we want to expand those into other school districts, but mandating all 200 school districts in the state into a strict model isn't the way to go.
Next question.
I've been a teacher for over 10 years, and I have to say that there are a lot of problems that I have with this whole idea. And one of the first is that I think that it sounds like we're trying to treat our schools like businesses. And I think that when you look at how schools operate, one of the basic problems that I have with this is that you're creating this sense of competition between the teachers instead of a sense of cooperation.
State your question, please.
How is this going to improve community within schools in a way that's going to benefit not only the teachers, but the wider community of students?
Very good question.
Why don't we
go ahead and address it first?
Yeah,
Why don't we try to
thank
keep
you.
to a 1-minute question answers?
That's fine. The questioner brings up a great point, and we had a very curious caller when Mr. Kropf and I were on Think Out Loud a few weeks back, who was comparing teaching to a career she had in sales, and they were monitored on their sales, and they got bonuses based on how many sales they completed. And the story I shared then and that I'll share now is when I started teaching 3rd grade, I quickly learned that 10 of my students were reading at a kindergarten level. And so I spent some time with those kids figuring out exactly where they were and what supports they would need in order to improve their reading skills dramatically over the year that I had with them. And I was really fortunate in that many of those students qualified to receive special education services. And I was fortunate in that our school, the 3rd grade teachers exchanged students for reading so that each child could be in a reading group that met exactly their grade level and their need. So not all of my students were with me for reading. Some of them were with the other teachers in our 3rd grade team. And I was also fortunate to have English language development that some of my students were going to, where they were learning how to read in English. And I'm not sure how you could monitor my classroom performance based on everyone else who was contributing to my students' learning and what I was contributing to everyone else's student learning. And I'm concerned that a system like this could have the unintended consequence of making the teaching profession more insular and less of team.
Jeff?
I personally believe that competition in public education is a good thing, because the way we do it, and we would have a philosophical difference there. We have 16 out of our 56 teachers for 2,500 students. We have 16 positions that are either lead teacher positions or master teacher positions where they mentor or some of the other teachers who are perhaps just coming into our system. And those are up for grabs every year. We allow people to compete for those positions. The competitive business model is a model that works in everything else in the world. And when it doesn't work philosophically, now I'm waxing philosophical here, when it doesn't work in a monolithic bureaucratic system where you only have one choice for education, then you end up with what happened when East Germany collapsed. East Germany had an official government car. The only car you could buy was the Trabant. And when it collapsed, the company collapsed and literally failed because it was a very it was an awful car, and the public wanted something else. I was the Trabant. And when it collapsed, the company collapsed and literally failed because it was a very, it was an awful car, and the public wanted something else, which is why I helped pass the charter law in 1999, and we got support from many Portland area legislators to convince Governor Keizer not to veto the bill, because people believed that, at least when it came to the Portland public school system, that we needed something else to try to get us to the next level of excellence in education. And I believe that competition is good, and ultimately if people want to remain within the process, they can compete fairly, but they have to be judged fairly too, and that's why teachers have to be part of that judging process.
Thank you. That ends our question and answers. We have now 1 minute conclusions. Jeff?
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I really believe that individuals, all of us want to be rewarded when we work hard and we do a good job. And in the teaching profession, we kind of do that, it seems. But when it comes to, I don't know, I've never met a teacher in all the years I served in public service or otherwise, and I doubt if she would disagree with me. Teachers don't go into the teaching profession to get rich. They go into it for noble causes and noble reasons. But they're also human beings. And they also want to be rewarded when they do a good job, when they go that extra mile, like some of the teachers that made such a powerful impact in my life personally. And I think our current system doesn't allow that to occur. It could, but in the opportunity that we have before us, this is an opportunity to say to school districts, you can implement a concept sort of like what we utilize at Oregon Connections Academy, that most of our teachers like, and that didn't cost us hardly anything to put together. So I would encourage you to consider all of the arguments and vote in favor of Measure 60.
Thank you. Dana?
Thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I just wanted to close by noting that Measure 60, along with a number of the other measures that you're going to be hearing from tonight, has the chief petitioner of Mr. Bill Sizemore, and you're going to be hearing actually directly from him tonight. And I'm sure he's an incredibly nice man, and I'm sure I'll get the opportunity to speak with him after. Unfortunately, Bill Sizemore has a history of using the ballot initiative process in Oregon in a way that doesn't always yield good results for Oregon families, children, and our community. I ask you to join the broad coalition opposing Measure 60. Thanks.
The next measure is Measure 58. It prohibits teaching public school students in language other than English for more than 2 years. In favor, we have Rosalie Porter, Executive Director of Reed Institute, and in opposition, Carrie Mize, Professor of ESOL Bilingual Education at Western Oregon University. Rosalie?
This is my first visit to Oregon. I hope I've pronounced the name correctly. I've been corrected a few times. I was chairman of the English for the Children campaign in Massachusetts. I helped write the initiative that passed in California 10 years ago with 60% of the vote. I helped the Arizona initiative 2 years later. And in Massachusetts, 68% of the voters voted for this change. The background in Massachusetts is interesting because we were the first state in the country to pass a bilingual education law. We mandated native language instruction for children who came to school without a command of English, our immigrant children, migrant, etc. And I entered the field of teaching a few years later because I became a true believer. I thought bilingual education must be the best way to help immigrant children. Since I came to America as an immigrant child myself, when I was 6 years old and didn't have a word of English, I really relished the idea of helping these children. Well, I became a teacher, and the way the Bilingual Education Act was written, we taught the children to read and write in their native language. We taught them their school subjects, and we gave them 30 to 45 minutes of English instruction a day. We were expected within a 3-year period to help these children move from learning in their native language to learning completely in English. That was the model, that was the idea. Well, I discovered in the first few years of teaching that it wasn't happening. Our children, after 2 years and 3 years, were not mastering English skills well enough to move into a regular classroom and do schoolwork in English. So they stayed 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. It wasn't that we did not have good teachers. We had excellent teachers in Massachusetts. We didn't have much in the way of books at the beginning, but we were developing good programs and materials. We weren't lacking money. What I decided on my own was that it was the model that was at fault, not the money, not the teachers. So I became a critic of bilingual education. My first book was titled Forked Tongue, The Politics of Bilingual Education. I became a researcher and writer in this field and an advocate for language minority children. I have met with thousands of families, mostly Hispanic, and for the most part, in fact, entirely, I have never described a bilingual program to a Puerto Rican or Mexican or Cuban family to have their response be, oh yes, I really want my children to be taught in Spanish. That's wonderful. No, the parents, and mostly not well-educated parents, have said to me, teach my child English as quickly as you can. I want him to have a good education. I want him to have a better life than I've had so far. That has been the sentiment that I have found. Since the change in the law in the 3 states I mentioned, the results have been quite dramatic. First, in California, which has almost 50% of the 5 million or so limited English children in our country. California is the best example of all. Oh my goodness, my time is up. I'll just finish that sentence about California, if I may. California has published data showing the increased academic achievement and English language learning of the children who come into school without the preparation in English.
Thank you. Carrie?
Hello, my name is Carrie Mize, and I am speaking tonight as a teacher educator from Western Oregon University. I joined the Coalition of Parents and Teachers Know Better because as a resident of Oregon, I care about our schools and our students. I was a teacher in California when a similar referendum, Proposition 227, was passed, and I saw the devastating consequences. English language learners, or ELLs, stopped receiving the services they needed. Teachers became frustrated trying to meet their students' needs, and administrators were tied up trying to figure out what they could and couldn't do. Because Measure 58 is so vague, there would be similar consequences here, and studies have shown that there was no benefit to California schools or English language learner population. The other side in Dr. Porter's opening statement is making it sound like this is a referendum on bilingual education, but it isn't. As you may have read in the Oregonian, English-only classes are already a reality in the state. 85% of students are receiving all of their instruction in English. But Bill Sizemore, someone who has no background in education, wants every elementary student to be given just 1 year to learn English. So English language learners would have to perform on par with their native English-speaking peers without English as a second language services. These unrealistic deadlines don't make any sense. Not only would Sizemore plans be ineffective, but it would be expensive to implement. The Oregon State Treasury estimates it will cost $500 million in the first 2 years. Sizemore never says where this money is going to come from. There's no dedicated funding source. Are we going to take money out of our classrooms for a program that will hurt Oregon's kids? Oregon is already doing a solid job of educating our students. In fact, I moved to Oregon because I was impressed with the unique programs that local schools developed. Sizemore's Measure 58 is so extreme that it would eliminate local control. Two-way or dual immersion programs, along with other successful initiatives, would be negatively impacted if not eradicated. These one-size-fits-all mandates are especially problematic for small and rural districts, where it would be hard to find the space and extra teachers for these additional classes. His idea to segregate English language learners is a civil rights violation that will definitely be tied up in the courts, and the bill for that will be left to taxpayers. Sizemore relies on Dr. Porter's research that supports English immersion, but her claims are based on personal experience rather than empirical evidence. Experts in the field have been discrediting her methodology and interpretation of data since her book was published in 1990. In addition, her views are inconsistent. For example, she was against Arizona's proposition because it was too extreme, yet the lack of any accommodations for students with disabilities make Measure 58 even more draconian than what was passed in California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. None of these states have been able to produce controlled studies that demonstrate statistically significant improvements in the academic outcomes for English language learners. By imposing arbitrary and unrealistic time limits, Measure 58 would create obstacles for kids learning English. It is going to be bad for schools, difficult for teachers, and most importantly, tragic for students. No matter what you think about the current state of education, this will not help. Please join me in voting no on Measure 58.
Thank you.
Hi, just a comment. I don't know what Mr. Sizemore has to do with the quality of the question before us. That just doesn't, it's kind of putting a little snow in this discussion. So, but I would like to know what have been the outcomes in these other states. You're saying it's been negative or nothing, and you're suggesting you didn't get to it, that apparently it was positive. And I'd like to kind of hear that drawn out a little.
The California experience, the Arizona experience, I have done research in the state of Arizona. They have shown, and Arizona has a large Hispanic population, their schools have improved dramatically. The superintendent of education, Tom Horn, for the state of Arizona, has published test data showing students within 1 to 2 years have mastered English well enough to do all of their classroom work in English and pass state tests in math and reading that are given to all students, English speakers, etc. The 1 year is not fictional. Most countries in the world have 1 year as the goal. Israel, Sweden, Germany. England, the countries that are large immigrant receiving countries, generally give 1 year of special help. That's where we got the 1 year. And 1 year is the goal. Students who need help beyond 1 year have a right to continue to have help. I don't know where the idea came from that special ed students would not get help. The cost,
From the measure,
the dollar,
58.
Pardon?
From Measure 58.
Special ed students who are bilingual are not going to be helped.
That is what it says, yes. What this measure does is it says for 1 year the elementary students will be able to be separated from English language learners in their own classroom, so they wouldn't be integrated, and they would have only 1 year to learn language. They would need after-school tutoring and summer help to keep up in their classes. That's why the bill, in part, why the bill is so expensive. There is a very fixed term, 1 year, and then they would be mainstreamed without any additional services. That is very fixed. That's why this measure is even more harsh than the English for the Children movement pen that you're wearing in California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. And actually, all 3 of those states have looked at data 5 years later, because it takes 1 to 2 years to learn social English, playground English, communicating, but it takes 5 to 7 years to learn academic content on level with your native English-speaking peers.
Absolutely not. That is a fiction that has been promoted by the mainstream press. Virginia Collier, who published the study that said 5 to 7 years to learn academic English, 2 years to learn to say, my name is so-and-so, what's your name? That study has never been considered reliable.
That is not the only study.
I'm sorry, the Collier study has no reliability. Even Kenji Hakuda at Stanford, whom you know about, Diane August, who did the study of 30 years of bilingual education research and published their results. They did not accept the Collier study. It has no relevance.
What they did is they pointed out methodological flaws, which is true in bilingual research. It is really difficult to separate language from academic content. But in fact, the research studies have not. Diane August just published a meta-analysis in 2005 that totally discredits what you're saying. So.
Did she go back on her own statement that native language instruction shows no
this isn't a
benefits for
referendum
children?
This is
Has she
not a
gone back
referendum
on
on bilingual education, as we've pointed out.
Okay.
Could we do 30-second conclusions, and then we'll come back to your question?
I think I've made all the points I can possibly make in support of this measure that I think will be valuable for the children of Oregon. The statement about cost, Oregon is already spending $200 million a year over and above the regular cost of public education on these children, and that's wonderful. That money is going to be used in new ways. It is not a measure that you have to compute. I don't know where the authority who came up with this figure got it, but it is not a fact. That's all
Carrie?
I can say.
Thank you. That was the fiscal impact statement done by the balloting officers. So I'm confident that Oregon voters will reject this vague and poorly worded measure that would have grave and unintended consequences for our schools and students. A coalition of 70 organizations, as was mentioned by Dana, that you trust unanimously oppose this measure. Measure 58 was not developed by educators, and there are no school boards that support it. That's because none of Sizemore or Porter's claims are supported by empirical data, just opinions. Measure 58 imposes arbitrary deadlines that create barriers for students. It makes no accommodations for students with disabilities, and it will take away local control. It would be another expensive and unfunded mandate. It will hurt students, it will hurt schools, and it will hurt Oregon.
Thank you. That concludes the first of our 3 parts. Thank you.